First things first, and I really want all of you to hear me, I am aware that good fan fiction exists. Or to be more accurate, I know that good fan fiction is possible. And I know that fan fiction in itself is a neutral thing, like all of fiction, and can be good or bad depending on the writer. I know that there are probably people out there, or at least there were at some point, who wrote genuinely excellent stories set in worlds of someone else's creation. I know that it is possible to write good fan fiction. However, in recent years, despite any outlying works of alleged genius, and they are outlying and not the norm, fan fiction has developed a manifestly particular kind of image and reputation. The aesthetics of fan fiction, if you'll allow me, have become a very specific sort. And that image and those aesthetics have broken internet containment and entered mainstream literature and storytelling. When I say fan fiction in a crowded room, 90% of the people in that room immediately receive the mental image of the same general type of storytelling, which, by the way, is not a very flattering one. Regardless of what you personally might think about fan fiction, the community and the majority of known works, and crucially the influence of fan fiction-ism has had on the rest of the storytelling media, has a very, very specific philosophy and aesthetic. Singling out your own personal favorite works cannot change that fact. When I made my little jab at fan fiction in my video on the rise of smut in fiction, many people came crawling out of the woodwork to send me various strongly worded messages about how wrong I was because, that one particular XYZ fanfic was good, actually, and because not all fan fiction is smutty, actually. Listen, I don't really care. I get it. Some of you like to read or write fan fiction, and some fan fiction is, to you, worth your time. But I'm talking today about the broad idea of what fan fiction generally has come to embody and mean in current year. So if you like fan fiction, that's your business. But before you get all fired up and start filling the comment section with angry remarks about how it's, not all fan fiction or whatever, try to take a step back and honestly observe the overall reputation that fan fiction has to the general reading public. Another quick side note, a lot of people seem to really appreciate the list of additional information that I provided with my video about reading education. This particular topic, fan fiction, is not something a lot of people outside those communities are going to know a lot about, and I spent months doing research. So to help, I've put together a small companion document on my website that provides links to some relevant studies and data, as well as more information on fanfiction in general, and also some of the more disturbing fanfiction content, scandals, and other issues of interest to outside observers who genuinely want to educate themselves. Some time ago, I said to a friend, half as a joke, that through no fault of its own, Harry Potter was about 70 to 80% responsible for the degradation of modern literature. And while that observation is still valid, I think it's far more accurate to say that the strange, unprecedented way in which Harry Potter collided with fan fiction is the real problem. In that sense, it would be more accurate to say that fan fiction is 80 to 90% responsible for the degradation of modern literature. And that statement is something I stand by. An essay I read recently, which I subsequently misplaced, observed that Harry Potter was the series that launched 1,000 ships. For those who don't know, a ship is when fans of a story will root for two characters to get into a relationship. Hence, ship. A person could be said to ship two characters, that is, hope they get together. In more modern usage, however, ship means that as far as that fan is concerned, those two characters should be together, or even are together, regardless of what the story says. And never before in history had this been as huge of an almost global cultural reality as it was during the heyday of Harry Potter. In truth, Harry Potter did something that was entirely unheard of in history, entirely by accident. Beginning with children's books, the series became an international sensation, and what was really unusual was that the length of the series allowed it to be a constant companion to an entire generation of children. Never before in history, in quite this way, had an entire generation grown up alongside a widely beloved group of fictional children. From elementary school through high school graduation and sometimes even college, Harry Potter and co. were all there too, and due to the nature of modern society and how modern people, especially young people, engage with stories, which we'll talk more about in a minute, this full absolute immersion had the most profound emotional and formative impact. Do you think YA literature is partly to blame for the decline in literature right now? Think fanfiction. Specifically, think Twilight, which was originally a work of Harry Potter fanfiction. Do you think E.L. James's 50 Shades of Grey is a major offender in the rise of smut in modern society? Think fanfiction. 50 Shades of Grey was originally Twilight fanfiction, and the list goes on and on and on and on forever. So yes, in a sense, Harry Potter got the ball rolling, but there wouldn't have even been a ball to roll had we not had fanfiction. But no matter what series started it, Pandora had opened the box, the bell had been rung, etc., etc. Fanfiction was here to stay. Worse than that, fanfiction was making tangible contributions to the shape and trajectory of literature and culture. And as a result, both have suffered massively, and we're going to talk about it. At some point, this was probably the early 2010s, I, naive, foolish, innocent, ventured onto AO3, that is Archive of Our Own, the main online fanfiction hub for the last 15 years or so, to see what there was to see. We're going to talk more soon about what a casual traveler is likely to find when walking the highways and byways of sites like AO3, but first I want to talk about some general observations I've made about the influence of fanfiction on popular culture and the literary world, and then we'll break down each one at a time. First, fanfiction is directly responsible for the epidemic of self-insert characters and self-insert mentality that has pervaded the entirety of storytelling across all mediums. Second, fanfiction is directly responsible for the smut-pocalypse that has devastated literature. Third, fanfiction is directly responsible for the meta-derivative nature of storytelling that is starting to become dominant. Related to that, fanfiction is partly responsible for the overall drop in literary quality and is directly responsible for the degradation of the art of writing, including but not limited to dismal world building and one-dimensional characters, as well as the elevation of arguably non-literary approaches to certain styles, such as the disproportionate use of present tense. The first issue is most definitely the most important, and we're going to approach it more broadly than mere self-insertism, because the real issue there, the core issue, is the immense inherently self-indulgent nature of fanfiction as it is in current year, and has been for probably at least 2 or 3 decades. This aspect, self-indulgence, is the first thing I want to cover, mainly because it's by far the most important. It informs everything else. So what do I mean when I say that fanfiction is self-indulgent? First, let's look at the definition of self-indulgence. To indulge oneself or one's inclinations. And indulgence itself is defined as, among other things, over-leniency, gratifying appetites and desires, lack of restraint, giving way to temptation or inclination, yielding to gratification. I know that there are some people who would hear all this and genuinely find nothing wrong, but I think an honest person who seeks to better and master himself or herself as a person or as a writer would recognize that such tendencies are damaging and courting disaster. Self-indulgence prioritizes pleasure over difficulty. Self-indulgence turns restraint, self-discipline, and self-mastery into problematic trigger words that are deemed some form of elitism or ableism or some kind of big badism. But what does self-indulgence mean in literature? Are we talking really long stories or long sentences or big vocabularies? Are we talking purple prose or an excess of adverbs? No, actually not at all. Those are all stylistic issues, and every writer, just like every artist, has his or her own style and will spend their lifetime perfecting and honing that style, even if some people hate it or call it inferior to other styles. Style is not what we're talking about here. No, self-indulgence for a writer means that every storytelling choice made by the writer is prioritizing the writer's fantasies, pleasure, appetites, and desires over the story, the characters, or the overall quality. To be clear, I do not mean that writers shouldn't write what they like or enjoy, but rather that writers who are honestly trying to write the best story they can and who are prioritizing the good of the story will very often put their fantasies and their emotional appetites and desires aside in order to make the story better. A self-indulgent writer would never do such a thing because the primary function of writing for a self-indulgent writer is personal gratification. And this necessitates the avoidance of anything that is particularly uncomfortable to the writer. Self-indulgence means that villains can't be too disturbing, or rather the wrong kind of disturbing, as that would be uncomfortable for the writer to write. Or, to borrow the new popular adjective, it would be icky. Which is where we get genocidal maniacs who are nevertheless really good at sorting out their minions' pronouns, and also would never use a racial slur. Being a genocidal maniac will in some ways serve the emotional needs of the writer, sure, but those emotional needs would be harmed if the villain was insensitive to gender issues, say. Self-indulgence means the heroes will have long conversations with each other about popular current year political issues, despite the fact that they live in 13th century England or 38th century Saturn or some random medieval fantasy setting. Self-indulgence demands, above all, representation, something we're going to talk about more in a minute here, but that's why you get an abundance of people of, say, African descent in stories set in Scotland in the 11th century, for example, or stories in which people who were not of period-accurate English ethnicity in most or all of ruling classes of Georgian Britain, with no reasonable explanation. Period accuracy is completely irrelevant to the self-indulgent writer who is only writing to feed his or her own personal fantasies and emotional needs. As I said, we'll get more into self-representation in a bit here. Self-indulgence is what drives writers to put themselves in their own stories, as often the main characters. Insanely, not only is this common in current year, it's also encouraged. Writers are told to write based on their emotions and their desires and needs. Writing is approached at best therapeutically and at worst narcissistically instead of artistically. In a world where art itself is inherently subjective, the only subject matter of any importance can and must be the writer. All right. So how does fan fiction produce this specific attitude towards literature and storytelling? Well, buckle up, because we have some bumpy ground to cover. Fan fiction, as I've said, has been around forever. There are some crazy folks out there who would go as far as to say that Dante's Divine Comedy is fan fiction. I think people who say that don't have a very good grasp on the spirit of medieval literature and approach stories with a fixed modern view, but Sure. Fan fiction, so to speak, has always been around. People tell stories, and then other people tell other stories in that same world with those same characters. Absolutely. We've talked a bit about cultural decay and the prevalence of postmodern philosophy on this channel already. We've also talked about how the modern way in which children are taught to read, with a strong emphasis on personal emotional interpretations of texts, that are guided by their superiors, of course, alters their ability to both think and write. So you should already understand what I mean when I say that the bulk of modern writers have a very different approach to the art and the practice of telling a story than used to be the norm. To call it self-indulgent is probably too kind, but the average young person with storytelling aspirations has, for at least a decade, been almost exclusively emotion-driven in every way. They have also been brought up saturated in the moral and cultural landscape created by social media, attention-seeking, self-absorption, narcissism, propaganda, emotional generative hot words, pop culture trends masquerading as important social themes, critical literacy, and the poisonous influence of internet politics have created anxious, fragmented, hollow creatures who nevertheless crave meaning and profundity in their stories. Combine that with the enormous emotional battering ram that they receive in college literature and creative writing classes. Combine that with the online influence of intensely aesthetically and emotionally self-indulgent online environments like Tumblr. Combine that with things like masculinity and femininity being under constant, confusing, endlessly shifting assault by the cultural police of our modern society. Many of these would-be writers then turn to their favorite stories for escape, stories they grew up with and which are, to them, a kind of cultural and narrative safe space. Stories in our times now like Twilight, Percy Jackson, Star Wars, My Hero Academia, Naruto, Sailor Moon, or, Harry Potter. Some more classically minded writers will fall in love with the Iliad or the Odyssey or Shakespeare, but none of these stories are exactly what these emotionally formed types of readers need in order to feel emotionally fulfilled in our constantly changing society in which emotions are the only valid currency. So they take to fan fiction to change these stories or characters or update them or shift things around so the story satisfies some specific fantasy or emotional desire. This can be relatively harmless, like a fan fiction in which Hamlet gets his revenge and then lives happily ever after with Ophelia. Or it can be incredibly disturbing, like fan fiction in which Princess Leia develops a romantic and sexual attraction to Jabba the Hutt during her captivity. And that's probably the tamest fan fiction I saw in AO3. In a normal world, such a diversion would be, in some cases, harmless and short-lived, which is to say, this kind of thing, minus the disturbing perversions, is normal in young teens, and then they grow out of it. In our society, people don't really grow out of anything. Ours is a society in which people have developed a prolonged, almost eternal childhood. This is aided by the immense prevalence of emotions. But regardless of the reason, if emotions rule, then emotions will always be served. And if luxuriating in fan fiction in which your favorite characters don't die and get together in the end makes you happy, you'll never stop. Because why would you? The story makes you happy, and being happy is the only thing that matters, right? And it's not like you're hurting anyone. As this indulgence is indulged, its grip on the mind of the reader and writer becomes strong enough to overwhelm anything else. A fan fiction that meets the specific emotional needs of the reader will always be better than anything on the shelves. A fan fiction in which the right character does the right things and says the right things and has the right opinions and has the right things happen to them will absolutely be deemed superior to, say, War and Peace, which I'm sure is probably pretty problematic. I don't know, have we canceled Tolstoy yet? Not that there's not, War and Peace fan fiction. I know what you're thinking. Why is it wrong to be happy? Why is it wrong to pursue something that is in itself not harmful but makes you happy? How is it any different to write a sappy fanfic than it is to write a novel of some other sort? Aren't all writers self-indulgent? No, actually, they're not, and it is different. The difference is that an honest writer who is pursuing self-betterment and excellence knows that sometimes the story needs things that he or she or the world doesn't necessarily like a villain who does vile things, or at least things that could potentially get him canceled on social media, like, say, a villain like Loki in the first Avengers making misogynistic remarks to a woman. I remember seeing people on Tumblr really struggling with that and refusing to believe that their beloved Loki would ever do such a thing, even as a villain. Or a hero or heroine who does something wrong and has to try to make it right, like Jane Austen's Emma. Or sometimes a story simply doesn't need the 17-page description of the main character losing her virginity, and so the writer removes it. All of these represent writers not basking in self-indulgence. Instead, choices are made not based on the fantasies and emotional desires of the writer, but on the best way to tell the best story. Please bear in mind, the best story and self-indulgence are somewhat subjective. A lot of it depends on the specific writer and the specific story. For some writers, giving into their emotional desire to have a happy ending no matter what is what constitutes self-indulgence. For other writers, giving into the emotional desire to have everything be constantly bleak and tragic no matter what is what constitutes self-indulgence. For other writers, having the entire story built around how hot the werewolf CEO is what constitutes self-indulgence. Often, an unbiased, reasonable reader can recognize self-indulgence when they see it. Sometimes what it is a constant battle taking place at the writer's desk. Here's an example. If you look at the earlier versions of Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian, you'll find that things like heavily emotional scenes had been cut. There's even one scene in which a glimmer of kindness from the kid was completely removed. Keeping them would have indulged McCarthy's own comfort with his characters, his desire to like them in a specific way, or even just inject his own personality or inclinations into his character's behavior. But he was certainly not self-indulgent, so they were cut, because he believed that would best serve the story as he was writing it. You tell me if you think the final version was better or worse as a result. And I'm not saying that all writing has to be as emotionally and descriptively sparse as McCarthy's, or that emotions or descriptions are inherently self-indulgent, but he was specifically pursuing a particular style in his work, and part of that pursuit was creative honesty and constant betterment. Creative honesty, by the way, does not mean bearing one's soul on the page. It means assessing honestly whether or not something is the best it can be according to one's goals, style, and abilities. McCarthy understood the danger of this siren call of self-indulgence, and he rejected it, and as a result, he became a better and better writer. Fan fiction, on the other hand, commodifies specifically the serving of highly personal emotions and desires, and pursuing stories with aspects which are uncomfortable or even, if you'd like, problematic, will be seen as the height of discomfort and controversy. There have been, within the fanfiction community, numerous scandals that have arisen over this simple factor: characters who behaved in uncomfortable ways. And uncomfortable to the fanfiction reader or writer means something that prevents the reader from identifying with the character entirely, or something that prevents the reader from deriving emotional, psychological, or even sexual release from the story. These issues can range from shipping the two wrong characters to writing a male character who somehow takes away the female character's agency, or whatever. This has now made it into the literary world, as I'm sure most of you are aware. Books especially find themselves under constant scrutiny. If even a speck of these uncomfortable elements is found, the writers and publishers will be bullied incessantly until the book is pulled. I have several examples on my website, but my favorite is Sparrow and Vine, which was attacked for having a character mention that Elon Musk was good at business. This is why also in books like Morning Glory Milking Farm, you get a page-long monologue from the Minotaur about how hard he's always working to make sure the main character never feels like she doesn't have any agency. This is fan fiction verbiage. This is fan fiction bleeding into mainstream fiction, and I think we can all agree, ruining it. The idea that stories must present a world or a situation that perfectly aligns with the writer's specific emotional ideal, especially in abstract areas like agency, are the direct result of writers coming up in fanfiction communities. These communities are populated by young college and high school age people being raised on a steady diet of internet everything, emotion-based reasoning, and political and social bullying of modern society. These young people have been conditioned to judge worth and value based on things like broad social literacy regarding current issues and having the correct political opinions, which, as we all know, are constantly changing. These young people then take these attitudes into these fanfiction communities where they do all the policing, all the moderating, all the judging and assessing. There is no oversight from literary authorities or even simply people who have a literary framing to their priorities. So these so-called literary fanfiction spaces are entirely built, operated, controlled, and populated by the subset of young people who then indulge together in all their fantasies and desires, sexual and non-sexual. That is, these spaces are perfectly politically and socially safe, according to their own set of ideals and values, while also being entirely permissive. These online spaces to these young people quickly become important and valid parts of their formation as people and, crucially, as writers. So then reading and also seeing the rising popularity in these spaces of the types of stories that will necessarily succeed there teaches young writers that good writing means that the story and characters must embody their fantastical ideals for social perfection and can't be too uncomfortable. This discomfort, after all, prevents the story from satisfying emotional fantasies to their utmost. So these discomforts are not only undesirable, they are morally and creatively unjustifiable. That's why in our era, stories in which a fictional character is racist are maligned and canceled because even the presence of such a thing prevents complete immersion in an emotional and psychological fantasy land. That is, it prevents self-indulgence. And these writers are being trained to genuinely believe that getting in the way of total emotional pleasure is bad writing. Examples like Sparrow and Vine, which was pulled before release after readers online expressed outrage over things said by the characters, are a perfect example of fan fiction writing mentality taking over mainstream culture. The author even said when she pulled the release that she would rewrite passages so they wouldn't contribute to harm. That's the kind of thing fan fiction communities train writers and readers to prioritize. But having a, as the writer described, flawed character in this book who expressed admiration for Elon Musk's business strategies was way too uncomfortable for readers, so it had to go. Any writer who gives into this kind of bullying is a coward and lacks all creative integrity. But that's what fan fiction does to you. I feel like I need to tap a sign or something. Of course, some select kinds of discomfort can be present, but only if they are tagged with content warnings. This can be anything from vomiting to the presence of food to eye horror to other things I can't mention in a YouTube video. As long as they're in the content warnings, you can usually get away with including uncomfortable elements, but you have to adhere to the content warning system. If you don't, you run the risk of potentially disrupting a reader's sense of comfortable emotional immersion in their fantasy land. And there are few sins higher in the fanfiction community. Why do you think people started demanding trigger warnings on everything? Now, of course, emotional and psychological fantasy lands are subjective. So one writer's sexual assault fantasy will be just that, fantasy land. And for another writer, it will be a story in which Lady Macbeth and Ophelia run away to open a coffee shop in Finland and talk about how powerful and independent they are while they're in bed or whatever. What I'm saying is that everyone goes looking for different emotional needs to satisfy, and like other kinds of tastes, these tend to be highly specific. That's why the tag system on sites like AO3 is so robust, and that's where that began for literature. Tags and hyperspecificity like that only occurs when the readers are seeking hyperspecific content to satisfy hyperspecific emotional or sexual needs, and have become accustomed to having those needs neatly labeled and accessible, because that's the whole point of fan fiction. Because here's the thing, yes, there's smut, and that satisfies sexual fantasies and sexual needs. But self-indulgence extends beyond smut, resulting in work that is essentially emotional smut. Its sole function is to allow maximum emotional satisfaction. If you look at the cloud tag on AO3, you can see some of what I'm talking about here. And these are only the most popular tags, so only a fraction of what's available. Let's ignore for now the plethora of disturbing sexual tags. By the way, what I've blurred here is stuff that I think I might not be allowed to show in a YouTube video. Feel free to go to the site yourself if you want to see the whole image. But let's look mainly at these other tags that signify a work that satisfies a specific emotional need or hunger. We can see hugs, happy ending, comfort, cuddling and snuggling, feelings, praise, kink, protectiveness, self-esteem, and so on. And we can also see tags that are meant to satisfy the reader's and writer's emotional need to see themselves represented, such as autism spectrum, LGBTQ, reader insert, gender themes, and so on. What a lot of people don't realize is that the need for emotional satisfaction, especially among young women, is almost as strong, if not stronger, than the need for sexual satisfaction, and can bring about a bizarrely specific array of subgenres and tastes, comparable to, sexual entertainment things. Let me give you an example. Show of hands, how many people know what I'm talking about when I say the word wump? Don't worry, I'm going to tell you. Wump, an old onomatopoeia for something like a solid body slam in comics, is the term that has come to refer to emotionally or sexually satisfying physical harm to characters. That is, scenes and stories in which a character is hurt in some way will produce emotional satisfaction in the audience. Don't get me wrong, this isn't always satisfaction that the character got hurt, like some kind of sadism. It can be, but not as a rule. This is more the emotional release of the physical harm and, crucially, the comfort that comes after. The emotional satisfaction comes more from the comfort than the hurt itself, so the hurt is satisfying because it presents the promise of future comfort, if that makes sense. This emotional need, once identified, became an object of indulgence. This fan-made, publicly available, highly detailed spreadsheet focusing primarily on Western media provides timestamps and descriptions for wump scenes in movies and shows, and has over 15,000 entries, including TV episodes, movies, games, podcasts, comics and manga, anime, YouTube videos and music videos, and so on. And of course, trigger warnings. On Tumblr, you can find hundreds of users who make wump lists for movies and shows and books, as well as GIF sets, or GIF sets if you'd rather, of these specific scenes with emphasis on whatever aspect the maker finds most satisfying, whether that's the pained expression of the hurt character, the sight of a chiseled body covered in blood, or the worried faces of the character's friends. Moreover, there's physical wump and emotional wump, and this can be even further broken down. Gunshots your thing? We've got wump for that. You prefer a nice head cold? We've got that too. How about torture, grief, crying, chains, handcuffs, stabbings, non-consensual stuff? Why do you want it? Which, by the way, is all with male victims. Needless to say, there's a large subgenre of fanfiction focused on wump. This is often called merely hurt comfort. You can also see it in these other tags, such as angst, that would be emotional wump, anxiety, self-harm, trauma, torture, medical injury, crying, comfort, and so on. What does this indulge exactly? It depends on the reader or writer. For some, it is absolutely sexual, and so the story will even veer into smut territory. For many, though, it's entirely emotional and fulfills some attention fantasy or caregiving fantasy, or what have you, of the writer or reader. Some will say that it's therapeutic, which is probably often true, but that's therapy, not literature. And a good therapist would probably caution against a constant, ever-increasing indulgence in works that could potentially re-traumatize the reader or writer. Of course, and this is a closely related issue, this notion that a writer's therapy session, even if it is beneficial to the writer, ought to then also be published for everyone else to read is both a very non-literary notion and is a direct result of fanfiction's nefarious, poisonous influence on the minds of writers, and is, in a sense, the absolute height of self-indulgence. Interestingly, very few of these fictions and infatuations feature female characters getting hurt. Feel free to discuss that one amongst yourselves. The bottom line here is that fanfiction has, for some time, been specifically and prominently a vehicle for the indulgence of highly specific emotional or sexual needs and fantasies. As these fanfiction writers grew up while failing to mature and broke into the mainstream, of course this attitude came with them. The thing with self-indulgence is that self-betterment as an author or writer of any kind is no longer what is important, but rather self-representation. The story has to, in every way, represent the specific ideals, desires, fantasies, politics, opinions, and aesthetics that the author values most. More than this, the story and characters have to represent the author the most. In a word, the story has to represent the author's identity. I've had people send me messages telling me that fanfiction is incredibly important because it allows representation and for them to identify with the characters. Fran Lebowitz is someone with whom I seldom agree. However, a lot of her opinions on books and readers and writers do have a strong note of truth to them, but never more so than when she said this: "A book is not supposed to be a mirror, it's supposed to be a door." She's absolutely right. The function of reading is not to find yourself perfectly represented in the characters and their environments. The function of reading is to explore other people, other ideas, other environments, other circumstances. You have full and constant access to your own mind. A book or any story is supposed to broaden your mind. How can it do that if it's just you replicated over again? If you want to see yourself, look in a mirror. That is not the function of a story. Self-indulgent, self-representing fanfiction isn't literature. It isn't even in itself valuable storytelling. All it is the mirror of the author, and therefore only has value to the author. And that value itself is fleeting and limited because all the author has done with it is presented in some limited form the contents not of his or her own mind, but of his or her limited specific emotional or sexual fantasy land. We see this now in mainstream media with the epidemic of self-insert characters, whether it's video game makers creating or changing characters to look just like them, or Rebecca Yarros writing a Mary Sue heroine who has the same medical condition she has, or a lesbian author making all of her sapphic heroines the most powerful, brilliant, wisest characters in the story. Of course, you're more than welcome to, as they say, write what you know, but this isn't that. People who indulge in this self-identity in their fiction are doing so partly out of that self-indulgence and that overall inflated sense of self-importance, but it also has to do with the entire attitude towards identity in fanfiction. Not only are writers expected to put self-insert characters in one form or another into their stories, they are also just as often altering existing characters to more closely resemble themselves. As in, for example, lesbian writers who make fanfiction in which the canon straight female characters are in a lesbian relationship, such as Arwen and Éowyn. Of course, if the writer isn't a lesbian, this might not be as well received by the readers. This goes further, too, with really hot-button social issues being inserted into fanfictions, such as HIV. Writing such a story while not actually being HIV positive yourself is something of a fanfiction faux pas. A strange phenomenon of fanfiction is the unwritten, soft rule that you can't write what you aren't. This extends to disabilities, diseases, and various specific sexual orientations and gender identities and so forth. If that isn't you, then writing it dominantly in your story isn't always entirely permissible, which is why people who aren't, say, Black or Hispanic will get in trouble nowadays for writing books with characters who are. Just another example of fan fiction helping to change the rules. How? Because fan fiction, given its insane popularity and its ever-growing readership, forms readers. These readers then go forth in droves on Twitter and Goodreads and make demands and demonstrate outrage and whatever else. Publishers, producers, and writers listen and then bend the knee. And every single time a writer apologizes or changes a book, the fan fiction-fed mob grows stronger, and the legitimacy of this fan fiction way of thinking about literature and storytelling grows exponentially. Why do they do it? Well, I'm sure the troll types in their parents' basements just get off on the power. But some of them, a lot of them, absolutely insist that literature and stories look like them. Now, placing oneself squarely and centrally in the text is a natural, normal thing for someone who grew up reading stories in which other authors were placing themselves in the text, and who grew up reading by inserting themselves into fan fiction stories, plain, blank slate main characters who were written specifically so that the reader could use that character as an avatar of sorts. If the emotional mind of the reader has been programmed to insert itself into the head of the main characters, then such a reader will obviously write their own characters also as self-inserts. For instance, did you know that there is an entire subgenre of fan fiction that is written in second person? These are stories in which the assigned ship, that is, the written relationship in the story, is the main character plus the reader. So if it's Marvel fan fiction, the story ship might be Bucky Barnes and the reader. That is, you walk into the room, you see, I don't know, Bucky Barnes sitting on the couch in your living room. He says, "You sure look pretty in that dress, although I would never objectify a woman, as you know." That kind of thing. It's very, very, very popular. Who do you suppose is the most important main character for writers and readers of stories like this? It's not even remotely surprising that all across media now, writers and artists are inserting themselves into their stories. Why wouldn't they? That's how they engage with stories, by inserting themselves into them, or even altering existing characters to become them. That's how fan fiction has trained them and the rest of society now to think it is supposed to be. So yes, of course, they're shamelessly making video game characters who look just like them. Of course, they're making their main characters have the exact same illnesses or disabilities or personality as they do. All of this is the most natural thing in the world to a fan fiction reader and writer. Let's take a moment now to talk about the one thing about fan fiction that everyone, especially those not in the community, most associate with fan fiction: smut. A lot of people took issue with my joking comment comparing sites like AO3 to OnlyFans, saying, no, there are non-sexual fan fictions, that's just incredibly dishonest and horrible. Seriously, you would not believe the number of messages I got scolding me about this. But here's the thing they apparently missed. OnlyFans has a non-explicit user base. 20% of OnlyFans users are not NSFW, and that number is going up. Yet if a lady said to you, "Yeah, I have an OnlyFans," my guess is the first thing you think of is not going to be a cooking channel. Like it or not, fan fiction has exactly the same reputation. If I was being extremely generous, I could say that 20% of fan fiction isn't smut of the strict observance. Let's put aside stories with random sex scenes and all that very extreme emotional onanism of hurt, comfort, etc. I would also like to point out that a lot of writers and readers think that as long as the scene doesn't involve, how to put this, the plug going into the socket, then it's not smut. So the characters can do all the other stuff, and there's a solid chance it won't get labeled sexual or explicit. So okay, let's give them 20% non-sexual content, just like OnlyFans. Yet, when you talk about fan fiction in a crowded room, the vast majority of people in that room will think primarily of smut and probably assume that that smut is pretty perverted. Here's the reality. Regardless of how many truly, genuinely non-sexual fan fiction works there may be out there, the specific nature of the smut that has deluged bookstores in recent years is the direct offspring of fan fiction smut, which is to say that fan fiction is directly responsible for that phenomenon. Do you remember what I said about Harry Potter, that it was the series that launched 1,000 ships? The reality, at least here in the West, I'm not sure about the East, is that shipping is the core function and draw of writing and reading fanfiction. This was always true. But Harry Potter sent the popularity of shipping in fanfiction to heights never before seen in the West. Everyone had very, very strong opinions about how the maturing young adult characters they had grown up with should pair up. Should Harry be with Hermione or Ginny or Luna or Ron? Should Ron and Hermione really get together, or should it be Hermione and Harry, or Hermione and Draco, and so on forever? The primary original function of fanfiction in the current age was always shipping, which means that at the very least fanfiction is intrinsically romantic, but also is often just as intrinsically sexual. As you can see from this random story I've pulled up on AO3, the major concerns are fandom, relationship category, that is it male-male, female-female, male-female, etc., and of course, the ships. If you take the inherently self-indulgent nature of the fanfiction community, combine that with the inherently romantic nature of fanfiction in general, and then combine that with the extremely permissive and shame-averse nature of modern society, you'll get a perfect storm of cultural and psychological conditions that will result in a whole host of young writers, especially young female writers, indulging every imaginable sexual fantasy in their fanfiction writing. This ranges from simple sex scenes involving canon couples to wildly, wildly disturbing torture and abuse stories that are hundreds of thousands of words long, that include themes that are so insanely horrifying and perverted that I literally can't show them to you. Let me put it to you this way. I've done all the dark romantasy, the Haunting Adeline and Dead Inside, and yet I was still somehow shocked and disturbed by what I found on AO3, which stories, by the way, were not obscure works tucked deep in the bowels of the site. These were stories with millions of views. A lot of the best-selling authors we see on the shelves of bookstores these days are merely smutty fanfiction imports. Twilight was Harry Potter fanfiction, then E.L. James wrote Twilight fanfiction. That became 50 Shades of Grey. Cassandra Clare's Mortal Instruments series is also Harry Potter fanfiction. Ali Hazelwood's The Love Equation is Star Wars fanfiction, in which Rey and that emo bratty edgelord are the shipped relationship, and so on and so on and so on forever. And many of the romantasy and romance writers who are big today will proudly talk about how they came up in fanfiction. Given the nature of fanfiction, what's popular, what gets hits, and what doesn't, most of these writers clearly learned the law of the fanfiction jungle and applied that to their literary pursuits. And that meant maximum smut equals maximum sales. And because fanfiction readers are also book readers, that actually works, sadly. And in the fanfiction jungle, what makes a story popular? Incorporating a popular ship? Yeah. Incorporating a popular and slightly unique twist on a trope, such as the alternate universe trope? Okay, maybe. Appealing to a particular subset of fanfiction readers, such as the hurt comfort crowd? Possibly. But if you want to take the easy road, all you really have to do is pack in a lot of sex. Many commenters and some people who sent me messages regarding my romantasy video a while back told me personal anecdotes of how they tried to write stories that didn't have sex in them and got no hits and no readers. And then one little micro story with an explicit scene was 100 times more popular almost overnight. And as we already discussed in that video, once you start to feed that hunger, it grows. On the screen right now, I have a list of some of the tags on AO3 as well as the number of stories that include that tag. This gives you an idea of what I mean when I say feeding the hunger makes it grow. There are more details about this on my website. Because I try to take research very seriously, I've tried to read a few less extreme of these stories. Stories I thought probably weren't going to be all that bad. After what I read when I did my research for the romantasy video. Let's just say my recovery is ongoing. If you ever want to lose all hope in the future of humanity and the literary world, go to the AO3 tag, Dead Dove Do Not Eat. Actually, no, don't do that. I did that and it didn't take very long to start feeling nauseous and incredibly disturbed and depressed. Sometime later, I happened to see a thread on one of the AO3 forums complaining about members of the fanfiction community who found that particular tag's contents too disturbing. If you don't like it, don't read it, they said. And also, golly, it's like we can't have anything bad happen to our characters. Sure, yes, if you don't like it, don't read it. But it's hard to see the things that are in there and not become incredibly concerned about the people writing and reading those stories. It's one thing to have bad things happen to your characters. No one's complaining about that. It's a whole separate issue if you're writing stories that are intended for sexual gratification that features so much inhumane brutality that the CIA is probably up on those tags taking notes. And don't even get me started on all of the underage content. Seriously, you will have to drink heavily if you even start to look around on AO3. And also then you see the number of hits those things get and you start to have thoughts like, how hard would it be to just delete the entire internet? The perversion factor, as with adult content across the board, intensifies over time. We've already talked about this a lot in my video on smut, but the same applies. However, because sites like AO3 are built on absolute permissiveness, as I'm sure you can imagine, it's about 1,000 times worse. As bad as some published dark romance books truly are, they are as tame as Mary Poppins compared to what you can effortlessly find on AO3. And all of this increasingly weird and increasingly perverted stuff is all filtering through to the mainstream. All these weird monster and animal smut books like Morning Glory Milking Farm, those trends started in fan fiction. And because, as we can clearly see from the aforementioned literary masterpiece, fan fiction now feeds popular literary culture. It will only be a matter of time before the most disturbing thing I saw in Dead Dove Do Not Eat is sitting happily on the shelf at your local bookstore. Smut in fanfiction is a world with literally no rules. Sure, yes, you are still expected to provide content warnings, and people will prefer more popular ships and so forth like that. But in truth, there are no rules. This is deliberately and explicitly stated by AO3. Nothing is forbidden. Smut with underage characters? Perfectly fine. Smut that would make the Marquis de Sade super jealous that he didn't think of it first? Why not? You want to write incredibly perverted stories about real people transforming into minors and having lots of sex? Totally, yeah. If you want to be only mildly disturbed, have a glance at how many fanfiction stories there are about real people. If you look at the numbers, currently on AO3, there are more fanfictions about real people than there are about Harry Potter. If a man did that about a real woman, it would get him fired from his job, shunned by his family, and would probably be sufficient grounds for a restraining order, depending on the laws of the state in which it happened. And it would absolutely be included in the court documents as People's Exhibit A in the stalking case against him. But when a woman does it, apparently it's empowering and creative. I don't know, Your Honor. Sounds like fanfic brain rot to me. Something I want to talk about related to the smutpocalypse is a topic that never seems to get any less strange to me, and that is BL. BL is short for boys love. It's gay romance, almost always gay smut, between two male characters, which has a disproportionately large female audience. Of course, BL is a little different from any other run-of-the-mill gay storyline. This particular hyper-specific subgenre got its start in Japan. Thanks, Japan. Its earliest form was, surprise, surprise, fanfiction. Specifically, fanfiction written by straight women featuring two young men, usually exceptionally beautiful young men, not so much masculine as somewhat androgynously beautiful. If you've ever wondered why so many romantasy writers refer to their male leads as beautiful men, one of these beautiful men is the, how should we put this? Submissive half of the relationship, while the other retains a more traditionally dominant masculine role in the relationship, if you get what I'm saying. Needless to say, this has a tremendously loyal female fan base bordering on feral. This is books, comics and manga, anime, and live-action dramas. BL as a genre sees its popularity fed by fanfiction, particularly gay shipping fanfiction, which in turn feeds the popularity of BL. This is a constant loop that has led to an explosion of popularity in the East and the West. While Japanese live-action BL hasn't really grown all that much, Thai BL has absolutely exploded in recent years. And in Eastern and especially Western viewership, the main audience for BL is, as I said, overwhelmingly female. I was made aware of the existence of this subgenre when I first started to develop an interest in Eastern media as opposed to modern Western media. And when it comes to Western popularity, BL is the subgenre of Eastern media, books, manga, dramas, etc., that is enormously popular with women. Most Western women I've come across who watch Eastern media include a huge amount of BL in the rotation. With, it seems, the majority of female fans, that's the popular Eastern media here in the West. They read BL novels and comic translations, and they heavily ingest BL and gay shipping fanfiction. In fact, if you go to Barnes & Noble and have a little browse through their translated Chinese novels section, I would bet you folding money that you wouldn't be able to find one that isn't BL. In fact, my efforts to find unofficial fan translations of published novels from Japan and China has turned up an interesting issue in the Western fan community for Eastern media. The majority of what you'll find fan translated is either explicitly BL or it can be interpreted as BL. That is, either fans ship the main male characters so hard that to them it's actually canon, or the novel was deliberately written to be very ambiguous in that regard. And the quality of the works does not matter, provided emotional or sexual needs are satisfied by the story. So people who are apparently more like me and just want to find a good book tend to lament this fact, saying that no one ever translates any Eastern novel unless it's BL, or one could say BL coded. I've heard this called BL brain rot. Speaking of which, recently, I got a comment on my video on romantasy. I tried to find it to show you, but after 3 hours of hunting, my eyeballs were about to fall out of my head. This comment was calling me a hypocrite for being critical of the explosion of smut in literature considering the book I was writing, referring to my serial novel, The Blue Prince. Given that there aren't any sex scenes in my book, I was really confused about this for a while. But then like 2 days later, it finally hit me. The commenter was assuming that my book is gay smut simply because the two main characters are both young men. A very alarming majority of these works have strange dynamics. The more dominant masculine character tends to be older or at least larger, often much older or much larger, and also tends to lack any sense of consent or boundaries. The more submissive character is often younger, or in the comics and shows, he at least appears younger and less experienced, and sometimes doesn't even start entirely gay. Not always, but often. Even if there isn't such a dynamic, as in the enormously popular Thai BL KinPorsche, the relationship often begins with sexual violence. In the case of KinPorsche, the series and the novel, one male lead literally sexually assaulted the other while he was drugged, which led to his, I guess, gay awakening or something. I don't know. I don't really go here. Just as gay shipping fanfiction created BL in the first place and saw publishers create it as its own genre marketed specifically to women, the spread and growth of BL has caused fanfiction hunger to grow, especially for the shipping of canon straight male characters, which in turn feeds the popularity of BL, and so on in an endless loop. The BL fandom tends to bring about the most intense, mentally ill, fanatical behavior from fans. Women have stalked their favorite BL actors, which suggests very overtly, if I'm being honest, that the infatuation is sexual in nature. And as is often the case with women, sexual infatuation very, very often must include a strong emotional element, which is why the story doesn't even need to be sexually explicit to satisfy a female fan's emotional needs. This is why Chinese titles like The Untamed have a frankly disturbingly enormous fanatical following. The original novel, The Grandmaster of Demonic Cultivation, was written as a BL, with the author later providing wildly explicit, often disturbing scenes that sometimes featured underage characters. It was so popular that China produced a live-action drama. I've seen the live-action Chinese drama. It's a little lacking in quality, but in terms of story, it's actually quite good. The dynamic between the two characters was changed to a friendship instead of a romance, and the change did make the story significantly less self-indulgent and allowed it to focus on the rest of the plot, which is a lot more interesting than what may or may not have been happening between these two dudes and, that sword in the bedroom. However, fans of the original novel inserted their own needs into the live action, interpreting the interaction between even the actors as romantic, even when they weren't in character. Fan fiction writers in the West and the East started to write explicit smut fan fiction about the two real actors, Xiao Zhan and Wang Yibo. In one case, a Chinese fanfiction writer on AO3 penned a long series that infamously culminated in Wang Yibo impregnating a much younger and obviously feminized Xiao Zhan, who worked as an underage prostitute. This created such a shocked uproar in China that, among many other things, the Chinese access to AO3 was blocked, and still is as of filming this video, and it became illegal to write such works or make art about real people or about underage characters. That latter part is kind of hard to get mad about, if I'm being honest. This is the kind of garbage that flourishes in the minds of writers who do nothing but indulge their desires and appetites and have never been told that such indulgences might not always be healthy or normal. But fanfiction is a hugely permissive community that rewards perversion disproportionately. It's not even remotely surprising that these things and these tastes grow and grow there. Now, this whole thing with China blocking AO3 has a million tendrils, and some of them are from the totalitarian absolute state control Communist Party side of things, yeah, and that's not great. And I have more about this whole thing on my website, but some of the Chinese outrage came more from the traditional healthy Chinese culture side of things that thought it was pretty messed up that children were being permitted ready access to wildly graphically explicit material about underage characters who were sometimes even real people. And I don't think any sane person would disagree with such a sentiment. What to do about it is an entirely different matter. To start with, it would sure help if parents paid closer attention to what their children were doing online, but that's a topic for another video. Something I came to see a lot as I explored the world of fanfiction was that whenever issues like this arose, that is, the worryingly large and growing amount of underage material on fanfiction sites like AO3, it was always met with widespread condemnation. That is, whenever anyone tried to say something along the lines of, hey, so maybe we should do something about all the insane underage material on this site, people would condemn that person with so much vitriol and violence, screaming about censorship and oppression and fascism and all the rest of it. To all the fanfiction apologists out there, this is a huge, huge PR problem for you. If the majority of your community would die on this of all hills, maybe it's time to take stock of what your community is, what it feeds, and what grows there. I'm really excited to see all the people bellying up to my comment section to drop some variation on fiction does not equal reality. Let me say it again. I don't really care. The fact that the fanfiction community has, since its inception, taken it upon themselves to defend to the death this kind of writing is really, really worrying. And one can't help but wonder if this constant indulgence in these BLs and underage fanfictions with increasingly disturbing consent issues and age gaps and the underage factor is perhaps a contributing factor in the apparent uptick in sexual crimes against young teenage boys being committed by adult women. The numbers for these crimes these days are honestly very alarming. If indulging the emotional and sexual needs on the page is permissible, then eventually the idea will enter the reader's mind that it must also be desirable in some form or other in real life. One 38-year-old woman who attempted to sleep with a group of young teenage boys in a hotel while her husband was in their own room told the boys that they should be excited to be sleeping with an older woman. Sorry, Your Honor, that sounds like fanfiction brain rot to me. BL or not, people can argue all day long that, oh, it's just fiction. Oh, we know it's just a story. We're not delusional. But if the whole function of fanfiction is to satisfy the need for self-representation and to see the self in the work, then that must radiate outward. If the self that you see and are satisfied by in the work of fiction brings you intense pleasure, then you will eventually feel the desire to embody that fantasy in reality, whether it's seeking a girlfriend or boyfriend who abuses you or becoming abusive yourself. On a long enough timeline, it always happens. It's worth remembering that studies have found that what we read tends to inform our opinions, our attitudes, and our behavior, especially in young people. So if a 16 or 18-year-old girl is reading fanfiction with really disturbing content that is meant to be sexually gratifying, it will have an impact of some kind on her character and her perception of the world. If you're curious about this, I have links to a lot of studies on this topic on my website. On AO3 alone, the number of fanfiction stories that feature underage pairings is over 360,000. These stories have hundreds of thousands of hits. The top one has over 4 million. And bear in mind that this is only works for which the writer has chosen to tag. Many writers choose not to and simply have content warnings, which can't be searched. There were many instances when I used the tagging system to exclude underage pairing and still got ships like Hermione Granger and Sirius Black or Severus Snape, or Petunia and Vernon Dursley, and Harry Potter. Honestly, just so much Harry Potter. At a certain point, you have to wonder what feeds that interest and what feeds that creation. All right, enough about smut already. Okay then, the final point we're going to talk about today is arguably the least important, but it's still a thing that needs to be pointed out. I talked before about how many of the writers working today got their start as fanfiction writers. The publishing industry will take the wildly popular fanfiction titles, which are, based on what I've found, always smutty ship fanfiction, and they file off the serial numbers, as they say, so it can be sold in bookstores. This is an old practice. The fact, as I said before, is that a huge percentage of newer popular writers, and pretty much any writer currently working to break into the industry, came up in fanfiction. That was their literary nursery. We now live in a world where the popular best-selling novelists did not come up reading great literature and studying history and philosophy and whatever else caught their interest. We live in a world where all the popular storytellers came up on a steady diet of fanfiction and critical literacy. Their literary communities were the, AO3 subreddit and Tumblr and LiveJournal and Wattpad and all those fan forums that predated AO3. And within that insular echo chamber bubble, the only thing that mattered was the fanfiction community sensibilities. Quality of storytelling, as you and I and everyone with a modicum of literary sense understand it, is not even remotely relevant. Does the work evoke the right emotions? Does it comfort the reader in the right way? Does it tickle the edges of the most popular tastes and excitabilities, emotional or otherwise? Does it respect the abundance of rules and regulations that are part and parcel with fanfiction, such as trigger and content warnings? Is it socially appropriate, and are you, the writer, allowed to write about the themes in the story? Are you, the writer, a non-problematic person with non-problematic behavior and opinions according to the current socially acceptable definition? The answers to these questions are infinitely more important within fanfiction communities than anything about plot structure, character development, quality prose, proper grammar, stylistic choices, and so on. Take one of these writers and transport him or her root and soil to the shelves of Barnes & Noble or wherever, and they're not going to magically start to think about these things. No, that's not important. Elevation of literary quality and prose and the effort and labor of constantly trying to improve upon your current abilities, these are concepts that are outside the field of view of the average fanfiction writer. And why wouldn't they be? Why would a fanfiction writer need to care about these things if they contribute little to nothing to the relative success or lack of success of their stories? For the record, I am not trying to shame fanfiction writers' prose and literary abilities. All writers are supposed to constantly learn and improve and grow. I know I'm working on that every day. What I take issue with is the fanfiction community's lack of concern for things like improvement and growth, literarily speaking. Of course, a new young writer posting a story online is going to be unpolished and inexperienced. Of course, I have no problem with that. That's not shameful, that's normal. But the proper way of things is for that writer to make constant effort to improve. And a writer's literary community is supposed to help with that. Sometimes that requires encouragement and praise, and sometimes it requires criticism. It also requires humility, maturity, and a certain emotional distance from your work. But one doesn't really see that kind of thing in fanfiction communities. Sometimes a comment or a typo or something like that, but the engagement with fanfiction, especially the legendary iconic stories, has little to nothing to do with quality of writing. One perceives, with a browsing of tags and comments, that the most successful popular stories are successful and popular because they do the best at meeting the emotional needs of the readers. These are writers who found a way to satisfy the largest number of readers' highly specific emotional and sometimes sexual desires. That has now become the metric for true literary greatness. Stories like All the Young Dudes, a Harry Potter fanfiction that might be one of the most popular fanfiction stories of the current era, are, by the fanfiction community, widely considered our era's War and Peace. Is it a good story? Like all popular fanfiction, this is a story that has as its sole function the emotional satisfaction of Harry Potter fans, particularly those who want to see a preferred popular ship, the original Marauders, Remus and Sirius, turned into young teenage boys who fall in love with each other and also have a lot of sex. I mean, in a sense, this is Harry Potter the BL. It might make a good fan fiction, but if you strip away the Harry Potter sheen and the Harry Potter magic and nostalgia and world and lore and characters, and if you strip away the emotional and somewhat sexual satisfaction of a popular gay ship, is it a good story? Maybe figuring out the answer to that question for yourself will help you understand a little better the reality of fan fiction. Because here's the magic. Fan engagement is what really fuels any story's perceived greatness. Fan fiction is by definition fan service, so many readers bring a solid 50 to 70% of the narrative and mental work into the story. That's the nature of fan fiction. The writer leverages the reader's pre-existing infatuation with the characters and world, and knowledge of the characters and world, to produce a completely engrossing experience that indulges every emotional desire the reader has. Take such a writer who has learned writing by writing fanfiction and have them create an original work. More often than not, world building will come out feeling flat and half-realized. And of course that's the case. Such a writer has no experience building a new world from scratch, so their storytelling knowledge is stunted, and they don't even know it because their fanfiction has always been very successful. The same goes for characters. Aside from the obvious overabundance of self-insert characters, the rest of a fanfiction writer's cast is going to be pre-created. They don't really have to worry too much about characterization and so forth. They can just stick to the characters as they are, or they can rely on the reader's pre-existing love for the characters to fill in the outline for them. Why do you think so many modern books and movies and even video games focus so heavily on fan service and meta self-referencing? It's a carryover storytelling strategy of fanfiction. Fan fiction is inherently derivative, and so writers who come up writing derivative works only know how to do that. Building a new world from scratch is something they won't have any experience in doing. They've come to rely on, as I said, leveraging their readers' pre-existing knowledge of the world and just working within that. As a result, a lot of the world building and general original plot development you see nowadays feels very samey and flat. More than that, for young aspiring writers, the insane internet superpopularity of stories like All the Young Dudes is the ultimate goal. Who needs the New York Times bestsellers list when your story has over 18 million hits on AO3? Who doesn't want their story to be read over 18 million times? I sure would like that, and I'm not ashamed to admit it. We all would. But the question that I always come back to is how that popularity is being cultivated and built. Many young, inexperienced writers will look at how this writer managed to capture the hearts of 18 million readers, and they will imitate it in fanfiction and in original works. And that imitation very rarely has anything to do with true literary betterment. It rather focuses on emotional satisfaction, appropriate fan service, proper representation, and so on. These are not literary concerns. These are not important, and their prevalence in literary pursuits is killing the quality of storytelling across all mediums. Fanfiction readers shape the market. Fanfiction writers produce the works, and so the world of storytelling has gradually taken on the image and likeness of fanfiction. What to do about it? Easy. Stop reading fanfiction. Yeah, I know. I said that what you read is your business, but if you really want to be a better writer or even protect your brain, I strongly encourage you to reconsider reading all that self-indulgent fanfiction. If you come across a book and the author's bio says, "Oh yeah, I love reading fanfic," don't read it. Stop rewarding the publisher's lazy commitment to literary shortcuts. If you're a writer, stop writing self-indulgent fanfiction. Read better books. Stop feeding the weird monster, and maybe it won't be powerful enough to control everything everywhere all the time. And before you yell at me, I'm not up here promoting the banning of free expression on the internet. Although, I do think it's disturbing that children of all ages can effortlessly access some of the most depraved garbage ever written in the history of creation, but I can't do anything about that. If you have kids, maybe don't allow them free access to the internet. My belief is that we, as adults with free will, should be doing a better job policing our own personal selves. No one has a gun to your head forcing you to read that 700,000 fanfic about the gay cannibal mermaid. You are allowed to say, no, I want something better, something with more substance, more truth, more meaning, something that doesn't indulge my emotions but challenges my mind. People should be trying to grow, and writers are not exempt from this. If you, as a writer, are constantly feeding your emotional needs and wallowing in emotional satisfaction, you'll never grow. Learn to choose the harder, less indulgent path and reject the siren call of easy fame that comes with things like smut. Be better writers, and readers demand more from your stories than mere emotional onanism. Demand until you get it, and keep demanding. Reject mediocrity, reject turpitude, demand betterment, demand greatness. Keep it up long enough, and we just might fix this. Anyway, if you've reached the end, thank you so much for watching. As I said, there are links to further reading and sources on the topics from this video on my website. I provided a link to that in the description. Anyway, that's it for this one, and I'll see you all next time.